National economies are more open to one another than ever before. With international trade at an unprecedented level, much of what people consume is imported, and much of what they produce is exported. Businesses send huge quantities of capital to other nations. In some countries, as much as half of all investment is made abroad. Millions of people migrate yearly in search of jobs. Manufacturers, farmers, miners, bankers, and traders must think globally about every economic decision they face. Technologies, artistic movements, business practices, musical trends and fads and fashions reach all corners of the developed world almost instantaneously. Global economy and culture form a nearly seamless web in which national boundaries are increasingly irrelevant to trade, investment, finance, and other economic activity. Many people now regard globalization as inevitable and irreversible. After decades of international economic integration, people in the world's economic centers think of global capitalism as the normal state of things, certain to continue into the foreseeable future, and perhaps forever. The situation at the turn of the 20th century looked remarkably similar. In the early 1900s, international economic integration was largely taken for granted. It had been the norm for the world's economic leader, the United Kingdom, for 60 years, and for the world's other major industrial and agricultural nations for about 40 years. Open trade relations, international finance, untrammeled international investment and immigration, and a common monetary order under the gold standard had been the central organizing principles of the modern world for generations. But it took only a few months for the entire edifice of globalization to collapse. World War I broke out in August 1914 and swept away the foundations of the pre-existing global economic order. For years, world economic and political leaders attempted, without success, to restore the pre-1914 international economy. The international order disintegrated and imploded brutally into the Great Depression of the 1930s and World War II. Globalization was a choice, not a fact. For decades, global capitalism had seemed unchanging in its basic outlines, but World War I showed it to be a series of points in a long and tortuous trajectory. Globalization unraveled so quickly that participants never had a chance to stop the collapse. An international order whose economic, political, social, and cultural components had defined the world for decades before 1914 disappeared completely. For 80 years after 1914, global economic integration existed only in the imagination of theorists and historians. Into the 1920s, attempts to rebuild the previous world economy failed repeatedly. In the 1930s, the nations of the world turned away from international economic connections and sought self-sufficiency.